The crystalline dome of the Intergalactic Sports Federation headquarters sparkled under the triple suns of Centauri Prime. Inside, Captain James Rhodes stood alone among 24 alien athletes, his weathered climbing gear a stark contrast to their sleek biomechanical suits. Grand Marshal Vexter, a towering figure with iridescent scales and 6 arms, observed the assembled group from his elevated platform. "Competitors," Vexter's voice resonated through the chamber, "you represent the finest climbers from across the known galaxy. Mount Eternus awaits your challenge." The holographic display activated, revealing a mountain that seemed to pierce the planet's atmosphere itself. Its surface was a maze of crystalline formations and gravitational anomalies, with storms of metallic dust swirling around its peak. Rhodes studied the projection intently, his expression neutral despite the whispers and clicking sounds of doubt from his alien competitors. Nearby, a Xerxian athlete named Kator flexed his metallic exoskeleton, the morning light reflecting off its surface. "The human's presence here must be some diplomatic gesture," he remarked to his companions, loud enough for Rhodes to hear. Commander Zixxa, a serpentine being from the gas giants of Proxima, slithered closer to Rhodes. "Your species barely has interstellar travel. What makes you think you can survive Mount Eternus?" Her voice was a mixture of curiosity and condescension. Rhodes continued studying the hologram, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "We were climbing mountains before we had fire." The simple statement caused several aliens to emit their species' equivalent of laughter. Vexter raised all 6 hands for silence. "The rules are absolute: no anti-gravity assistance, no quantum tunneling, no molecular phase shifting. This is a test of pure climbing ability." His eyes fixed on Rhodes, though some might find these restrictions particularly challenging. The human captain finally turned from the hologram. 20 years of Earth's Special Mountain Operations Force had left their mark on his face, scars from avalanches, frostbite, and close calls on peaks that had claimed many lives. "Will we be allowed basic safety gear, oxygen supplies, temperature regulation?" "Basic survival equipment only," Vexter confirmed. "Though I doubt your primitive gear will suffice past the first gravitational shift zone." The assembled aliens began checking their biomechanical enhancements and adaptive suits. Rhodes simply tightened the straps on his traditional climbing backpack, filled with gear that would have been familiar to climbers a century ago, save for a few modern improvements. The Centaurian transport beam was scheduled to deliver them to the base of Mount Eternus within the hour. As the competitors prepared, Rhodes remembered his last climb on Earth, Mount Everest in a Category 5 storm, rescuing stranded climbers when all modern equipment had failed. He had learned then what these aliens were about to discover. Technology was a tool, not a solution. A young Andromedian climber, Pix, approached Rhodes with what seemed to be genuine interest. Her crystalline body chimed softly as she moved. "Your confidence is either admirable or foolish, human. Mount Eternus has claimed the lives of beings far more evolved than you." Rhodes checked his oxygen regulator, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Evolution is about adaptation, not advancement. Your people might be able to survive in space naturally, but my ancestors survived an ice age with nothing but fire and determination." The chamber's lights dimmed, signaling the approaching departure. As the competitors moved toward the transport area, Rhodes took a final look at the holographic mountain. Its peak disappeared into swirling storms of metallic ice and gravitational distortions. The aliens around him might have biology and technology on their side, but they had never learned what humans knew in their bones, that sometimes survival meant embracing the mountain's challenges rather than trying to overcome them. "Transport sequence initiating," announced the automated system. Rhodes closed his eyes, feeling the familiar pre-climb tension in his muscles. He had spent his life proving that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their physical capabilities, but their refusal to accept limitations. The transport beam engaged, and as their molecules began to shift, Rhodes heard Vexter's final words, "May the strongest species prevail." The human captain allowed himself a small smile. They still didn't understand. It was never about being the strongest. The transport beam dissipated, leaving the competitors at the base of Mount Eternus. The mountain loomed above them, its crystalline surface refracting the light of 3 suns into dazzling arrays of color. The air was thin even at the base, carrying microscopic particles of metallic ice that glinted like stars in the alien atmosphere. Kator activated his exoskeleton's sensors immediately, the metal plates shifting and recalibrating to the environment. "The first gravitational shift zone begins 800 meters up," he announced to no one in particular, his metallic fingers extending into climbing spikes. "The human won't even make it that far." Rhodes ignored the commentary, his eyes scanning the mountain's face with practiced precision. The surface appeared smooth from a distance, but he could see the network of natural handholds, tiny imperfections in the crystalline structure that would support his weight. He began his ascent without fanfare, while the others were still analyzing data and adjusting their equipment. Commander Zixxa slithered up the surface with remarkable speed, her serpentine body adapting to every contour. "Watch and learn, primitives," she called back, her scales changing color to match the mountain's surface. But her satisfaction was short-lived. As she crossed the 500-meter mark, her adaptive camouflage suddenly flickered and failed. The crystalline surface was emanating some kind of interference. Rhodes maintained a steady pace, his movements economical and precise. He had already noticed the strange properties of the mountain, how it seemed to react to advanced technology, how the crystalline formations subtly shifted under certain frequencies. His primitive gear had no electronics to fail, no complex systems to interfere with. The first casualty came 3 hours into the climb. An Arcturian climber, relying too heavily on his quantum-anchoring boots, screamed as the technology failed mid-step. His backup systems sparked and died, leaving him clinging to the mountain with rapidly freezing appendages. The rescue drones deployed from the base, extracting him before the cold could claim his life. Pix, the Andromedian, found herself climbing near Rhodes. Her crystalline body gave her natural advantages on the similar surface, but she was fascinated by his technique. "You're not even using gravitational compensators," she observed, her voice chiming like wind through glass. "Don't need them," Rhodes replied, his breath visible in the thinning air. "The mountain tells you where gravity shifts if you know how to read it." He demonstrated by adjusting his route slightly, moving around a section where the other climbers were struggling against an invisible gravitational eddy. Kator, watching from above, grew increasingly frustrated as his high-tech solutions failed one by one. "Impossible," he muttered, watching Rhodes maintain his steady progress. "Your species cannot possibly understand these conditions better than our advanced systems." The human captain secured another handhold, checking his oxygen levels with a quick glance at his analog gauge. "Understanding and controlling are different things," he called up to Kator. "We learned that lesson the hard way on Earth." As they approached the first major gravitational shift zone, the mountain revealed its true dangers. The crystalline surface began to sing, vibrating at frequencies that interfered with the aliens' neural interfaces and sensory enhancements. 2 more competitors were forced to retreat, their bodies unable to cope with the resonance. Rhodes felt the vibrations through his gloves, through the soles of his boots. It reminded him of the wind songs in Earth's highest peaks, how they would change just before an avalanche. He adjusted his pace and path accordingly, working with the mountain's rhythm rather than fighting against it. Commander Zixxa, still in the lead but struggling increasingly with equipment failures, watched Rhodes with growing unease. The human's primitive approach was proving more reliable than centuries of technological advancement. "Perhaps," she called down to him, "there is something to be said for simplicity." The first gravitational shift hit without warning. The mountain's crystal lattice realigned itself, creating a zone where up became a relative concept. The alien climbers with their advanced suits tumbled and spun, their technology unable to compensate fast enough for the radical changes in directional force. Rhodes simply braced himself against his current handholds, letting his body adapt to the new orientation. Years of free climbing had taught him to trust his inner ear, his natural sense of balance. When the shift stabilized, he was one of the few still maintaining their original position. As the first day of climbing drew to a close, the mountain had already claimed half of the competitors. The remaining aliens watched with a mixture of frustration and dawning respect as Rhodes continued his methodical ascent. He wasn't in the lead. Commander Zixxa and Kator were still ahead, though struggling. But he was the only climber who hadn't experienced a single equipment failure or required emergency assistance. From the base camp, Grand Marshal Vexther observed the proceedings with increasing interest. The humans' performance was disrupting centuries of assumptions about technological superiority. As the triple suns began to set, casting the mountain in sheets of multicolored light, Vexther made a note in his report. Perhaps we have been measuring advancement by the wrong metrics. The remaining climbers found stable positions to rest for the night, securing themselves to the mountain's face. Tomorrow would bring them above the atmosphere shield, into regions where the very laws of physics began to break down. As Rhodes checked his anchors one final time, he allowed himself a small smile. The mountain hadn't even shown them its true challenges yet. The second day on Mount Eternus began with an ominous humming that resonated through the crystalline surface. The mountain's upper reaches had disappeared into a swirling maelstrom of metallic clouds, crackling with electromagnetic energy. Rhodes watched the storm build as he checked his gear, noting how the crystal formations around them had begun to pulse with a faint, rhythmic light. "My atmospheric analyzers are malfunctioning," Kator announced, frustration evident in his metallic voice. His exoskeleton sparked slightly as another electromagnetic pulse washed over them. "The storm's electrical signature is unlike anything in our databases." Commander Zixxa, still in the lead but visibly fatigued, raised her head toward the approaching storm. "We should wait it out," she suggested, her serpentine body coiling tighter against the mountain's face. "No climbing species can survive those energy levels." Rhodes continued his preparations quietly, replacing his standard rope with a carbon fiber cord that wouldn't conduct electricity. He had seen similar storms in Earth's Himalayan ranges, where unexpected electrical phenomena would render modern climbing gear worse than useless. "The mountain's getting warmer," he observed, feeling the heat through his gloves. Pix, her crystalline form resonating with the mountain's frequencies, chimed in agreement. "The storm is exciting the crystal matrix. The entire peak is becoming energized." She paused, her transparent body refracting the strange lights above. "But you knew that already, didn't you, human?" Before Rhodes could respond, the storm descended upon them. The air filled with charged particles that danced like fireflies around their bodies. Kator's exoskeleton immediately went into emergency shutdown, leaving him clutching desperately at his handholds. Commander Zixxa's adaptive scales began to malfunction, leaving her exposed to the rapidly changing conditions. Rhodes moved steadily upward, using the storm's own light to find his path. The crystalline surface had indeed grown warmer, making the previously freezing handholds more manageable. Where others saw chaos, he recognized patterns. The way the electrical charges followed certain paths through the crystal, how the gravitational anomalies created pockets of relative calm. "Impossible," Kator shouted over the storm's roar, watching Rhodes climb past him. "Your primitive equipment should have failed by now. How are you still moving?" "Can't fail if there's nothing to fail," Rhodes called back, securing another handhold. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." His rope held firm, the simple mechanical ascenders working flawlessly while the aliens' quantum anchors and gravity nullifiers sparked and died around them. Pix, whose crystalline nature gave her unique insights into the mountain's behavior, began to follow Rhodes's route. "The human isn't fighting the storm," she realized aloud. "He's using its energy patterns to find safe passages." Her own body hummed in harmony with the mountain, allowing her to verify his chosen path. The storm intensified, bringing with it shards of metallic ice that cut like knives through the electrified air. 3 more competitors were forced to trigger their emergency beacons, their bodies or equipment unable to withstand the assault. Commander Zixxa, despite her pride and natural advantages, found herself slipping further behind as her technological aids continued to fail. Rhodes pressed on, his breaths measured despite the thinning air. The storm had transformed the mountain into a living thing, its crystal veins pulsing with energy that flowed in predictable patterns, if you knew how to look for them. He had learned long ago that mountains had their own logic, their own rhythms. Fighting them was futile, understanding them was everything. A massive electromagnetic pulse suddenly rippled through the mountain face, stronger than any before. Kator, who had been struggling to restart his exoskeleton, lost his grip entirely. His safety systems, fried by the storm, failed to engage. Without hesitation, Rhodes swung out from his position, anchored by his simple mechanical clips, and caught the alien's arm. "Why?" Kator demanded as Rhodes helped secure him to a stable position. "I mocked you, dismissed you, yet you risk your own progress to save me." Rhodes checked the anchor points before preparing to resume his climb. "Because that's what climbers do," he said simply. "On Earth, we learned that the mountain doesn't care about our differences. Up here, we're all the same." The storm raged on, but something had changed in the way the alien competitors viewed their human counterpart. They watched as Rhodes navigated the electrical maelstrom with nothing but experience and basic gear, proving that progress didn't always require advancement. Pix, still matching Rhodes's pace, called out over the howling wind. "Your species is full of contradictions, Captain Rhodes. You climb with sticks and strings, yet you understand this alien peak better than our quantum computers. You compete against us, yet you risk yourself to save us." Rhodes secured another handhold, the storm's energy illuminating the crystals around him like a bioluminescent cave. "Humanity's greatest strength," he replied, "isn't our technology or our physical capabilities. It's our ability to adapt, to learn from every environment we encounter. We don't need to be the strongest or the most advanced. We just need to understand." As the storm began to subside, the remaining climbers found themselves in a transformed landscape. The mountain's upper reaches now glowed with residual energy, creating an otherworldly aurora that danced through the crystal formations. They were now well above the planet's atmosphere shield, entering a realm where even the most basic laws of physics became unreliable. Grand Marshal Vexther's voice crackled through their emergency communication devices, the only technology still functioning after the storm. "The final ascent begins now. May the most worthy reach the summit." Rhodes looked up at the challenging terrain ahead, then back at his fellow climbers. The mountain had stripped away their technological advantages, leaving them with something more valuable: respect for each other's strengths, and the understanding that true progress sometimes meant returning to basics. The aftermath of the storm left the remaining climbers in a realm that defied conventional physics. Crystal formations floated freely, untethered by gravity, creating an ever-shifting maze of pathways toward the summit. The air had become so thin that even the alien species were struggling to process it, their specialized respiratory systems straining against the hostile environment. Rhodes checked his oxygen gauge, noting the rapidly depleting supply. The next few hours would test not just their climbing abilities, but their capacity to function in conditions that bordered on deep space. His years of high-altitude climbing had prepared his body for oxygen deprivation, but even he could feel the mountain's toll mounting. "Your breathing technique," Commander Zixu observed, her own respiratory system showing signs of stress. "It's different from before." She had fallen back to Rhodes's position, her technological advantages nullified by the mountain's strange properties. The final ascent of Mount Eternus began in perfect silence. The four remaining climbers, human, Xerxian, Andromedian, and Serpentine, moved as one through the crystalline maze, their movements synchronized with the mountain's pulses of energy. Rhodes led them not along any visible path, but through the flows of power that coursed through the crystal structure itself. "The energy patterns," Pix observed, her crystalline body glowing with the same frequencies as the mountain, "they're not random, they're calling to us." Her form had begun to merge with the surrounding crystal, making her nearly invisible except for the outline of her movements. Rhodes nodded, feeling the mountain's rhythm through his simple tools. The compass spun in complex patterns, each rotation matching the surge of energy through the crystal walls. "It's like a heartbeat," he said. "The whole mountain is alive, and we're inside its circulatory system." Kator, his mighty exoskeleton now completely defunct, moved with surprising grace using only his natural strength. "All our technology, our supposed advancements, They were blocking us from feeling this connection. The Xerxian's metallic skin had taken on the same iridescent qualities as the surrounding crystal. Commander Zixxa slithered through a particularly complex gravitational eddy, her movements fluid and natural. "Your Earth mountains," she asked Rhodes, "are they alive like this one?" "In their own way," Rhodes replied, securing another handhold as reality shifted around them. "Every mountain has its own personality, its own lessons to teach. We just forgot how to listen." He paused, studying the crystalline wall ahead. "That's humanity's cycle. We advance until we lose touch with fundamental truths, then have to rediscover them." The summit loomed closer, its peak now a blinding beacon of pure energy. The crystal maze had become so dense that normal climbing techniques were impossible. Instead, they had to flow with the mountain's pulses, moving between fragments during momentary alignments of gravity and energy. Suddenly, the mountain's rhythm changed. The crystal formations began to pulse faster, more intensely. Pix's body resonated with the new frequency, sending harmonic waves through the structure. "It's not just testing us," she realized, her voice carrying a new understanding. "It's trying to communicate." The crystal wall before them split apart, revealing a direct path to the summit. But it wasn't a path meant for conventional climbing. The space between them and the peak was filled with pure energy, crackling with power that would destroy any remaining technology. "The final test," Commander Zixxa said softly. "We have to trust the mountain completely." Rhodes studied the energy field, remembering every lesson the mountain had taught them. "We don't climb to the summit," he said. "We let the summit come to us." He turned to his fellow climbers. "We have to synchronize with the mountain's energy, move with it, not through it." Kator, looking at the impossible gap, found himself laughing. "A test of climbing that requires us not to climb. The universe has a strange sense of humor." He had come so far from his initial disdain for primitive methods, now fully embracing the mountain's deeper wisdom. Together, they began to match their movements to the mountain's pulse. Pix's crystalline resonance helped them find the rhythm, while Commander Zixxa's fluid motions showed them how to flow with the energy rather than fight it. Kator's strength, stripped of technological enhancement, provided the stability they needed. Rhodes closed his eyes, feeling the mountain's energy through his basic gear. Every piece of equipment he carried, every technique he had learned over decades of climbing, had prepared him for this moment, not because they were superior, but because they kept him connected to the fundamental nature of what he was doing. The energy field surrounded them, lifting them toward the summit. Their bodies began to glow with the same light that pulsed through the mountain's crystal heart. In that moment, they weren't separate beings anymore. Human, Xerxian, Andromedian, and Serpentine had become part of Mount Eternus itself. They reached the summit not as conquerors, but as students who had finally learned their lesson. The peak was a single perfect crystal, pulsing with the combined energy of all who had attempted the climb. As they touched it, each of them received a vision of understanding, not just of the mountain, but of themselves and their place in the universe. Grand Marshal Vexther's voice echoed through their minds, carried by the mountain's energy. "The test was never about reaching the summit," he said. "It was about understanding that true advancement isn't measured by the tools we create, but by our ability to know when to set them aside." Rhodes smiled, touching the crystal peak with his bare hand. "Humans learned that lesson once long ago, then we forgot it. Now we're learning it again." He looked at his fellow climbers, seeing in them the same transformation he felt in himself. Maybe that's the real cycle of advancement, not building bigger things, but remembering the wisdom in smaller ones. The mountain's energy surged one final time, broadcasting their achievement across the galaxy. But the message wasn't one of victory or conquest. Instead, it carried a deeper truth, that in stripping away their technological advantages, the mountain had revealed something far more valuable: the understanding that true progress often means returning to basics, and that the greatest achievements come not from overpowering nature, but from learning to move in harmony with it. As they began their descent, forever changed by their experience, the mountain's crystals continued their eternal dance, waiting for the next generation of climbers to learn these timeless lessons anew.